Hi there. What makes a good testimony for you? I'm not talking about amazing testimonies. I'm not talking about the ones that you might immediately think of in your head, where somebody you know came to Christ and their life was turned around from drink or violence or drug abuse. I'm not talking about the person you know who was raised up from their hospital bed when they'd been ill for months or years. But I'm talking about the ordinary, everyday ones that can come up in a natural conversation and lead straight back into further conversation. That's what I want to talk about today. You see, as we look ahead to the summer, one of our biggest outreach focuses for the summer is going to be the Encounter Festival. We're talking about encountering Jesus, what it was like for the people in the Gospels to encounter Jesus, and our own testimony of what it's like to encounter Jesus. And part of that will be ordinary people like you and me having ordinary conversations with other ordinary people in which we point to Jesus Christ. And funny enough, it takes some practice. So I think I've shared on some Sundays some of the amazing stories that God has been at work about in McNichol family life. You know, times when God's been with us through some really difficult medical diagnoses, or Caroline's friend who was healed miraculously of a brain injury, or the time that God called me 3 times in 24 hours to go into full-time Christian work. Those stories do come up every now and again, but I'm talking about the everyday. And I want to give you an example. This is one of my favourite spots in Shotover. This tree here behind me, you can't really see in the angle of the video, but it goes up steeply from the path. By the top, it's about 30 foot off the ground. It's quite a climb unless you're in the right shoes. And I was going past one day, and I decided I'd like to give it a go climbing. And as soon as I'd got halfway up, I thought, this is harder than I thought. And I sort of kept wanting to turn back. But eventually I got to the top, and I was just sitting up there and spending a bit of time praying. And I had this really interesting experience of, I just felt like God dropped into my heart the words, "You're risk averse." And as soon as I thought about it, I thought, that's true. Just the way I was climbing up that tree was risk averse. The way that I play board games is risk averse. Suddenly it all sort of started to play over my head. I always like to do something that I can undo if it doesn't go well. And I felt like God just prodded me on it and said, that's not how I want you to be. And that was what there was, that was the substance of it. But what that led into actually was 2 months that I hadn't really expected of needing to be a risk taker in how I was leading at the church. And if I'd not had that experience of God preparing me, then I think I would have gone about it in a sort of very tentative way and wouldn't have led well. Now, that's the kind of story that I could just drop into conversation. We could be walking through a forest and I can say, oh yeah, I had this really interesting experience once when I climbed up a fallen tree, and I could lead really, really easily into that. It could come out of a conversation about risk. It could come out of a conversation about how we go about leading, or about how my work was going. There are so many different ways into that conversation. It's a short story which points to an encounter between me and God, and in which God is the hero. He's the one who prepares, he's the one who does the interesting thing. And then off the back of that, all you have to do is say, so what about you? Have you ever had an experience of, feeling like somebody or something was preparing you for the coming season in a way that you hadn't expected? You would be really surprised the number of people who would say they weren't religious and yet have had an experience like that they can point to. I remember a friend of mine at school whose parents were not religious, and one of them had had an experience on the motorway where they'd very, very nearly been in an accident and just felt like somehow they'd managed to get through a gap that they shouldn't have been able to get through and avoid the accident. And they just said, I think someone up there was looking out for me. So people have these touch points, and an ordinary conversation can open them up. But it does need us to think about what we'd say, how we'd lead into a story of God at work, what God's been up to. We need to recall that and bring it to mind, and how we'd then bring it back to what about you in a way that draws them into the conversation. So I want to encourage you this week, and actually as we go into the summer, have a think, what are your good stories? Not necessarily your amazing ones that change the world forever, but your good stories that you could bring up in everyday conversation and point to the glory of Jesus.